Hi there, business owners, directors, and marketeers. Our guest in today's show is Johannes Hoech. He is the CEO, founder of Marqetu, a software augmented consulting company focused on architecting predictable growth. With his team, he has successfully scaled multiple B2B demand generation implementations from nearly zero to 75% of new business pipeline in only 9 to 18 months, and collectively produced 400 million in closable B2B pipeline. I'm Simon, your host of today's show. With that, it's good to have you on the show today, Johannes. Would you like to share a little bit more about yourself and Marqetu? What is it all about?
Yeah, thank you. No, first of all, thanks for having me. And the Marqetu was born out of my experience as a CMO for 10 years or so, where I've worked with several cloud-based technology startups, and I've been here in the Silicon Valley since 1990. And switched over to the high-velocity marketing model back in the sort of mid-2000s when Marqetu was just making its entry and so forth. And really then implemented in rapid succession several growth programs where we generated high-velocity pipeline for these tech startups and B2B startups. I've always had an overabundance of applications, but there was very little at the C level to pull it all together so that when my CEO or the board would come in and say, okay, I want to make $5 million next year or 10 million, whatever my growth goal is, where is it going to come from? That's the first question. The second question is, how am I doing? Are we on plan? And right now, 99.9% of organizations basically answer those two questions with a very large constellations of spreadsheets and marketing applications that have to be sort of hand-stitched together, where you have Marqetu and Visible and Salesforce and LeadSpace and on, and you have all these analytics, your sales acceleration software, SalesLoft, whatever it is. And you now have to pull that together to have some sort of a picture end-to-end from first contact lead all the way through to closed won business. How am I doing and where's my business coming from? Very few organizations know that. And so we actually pulled together a piece of software to replace the 2, 3, 4 people and the 50 spreadsheets that it normally takes to manage that process with a consolidated approach and a consolidated piece of software, and that's what Marqetu does.
Perfect. So your main focus group, as you said, are SaaS companies.
B2B.
What industries? Yeah, SaaS B2B companies. What industries would they come from?
The immediate sector that we aim at initially was SaaS B2B companies, so it's by definition a tech company. Software company. However, we've since been approached by several services organizations because they have a very similar sales approach, and they as long as it's a B2B sale, it's not something that's usable for B2C. And so I have that, and then I also get some interest from the investment community because when we press a company through the software, it comes up with a quick snapshot on. Here's what they say in the PowerPoint. Do the numbers actually support that? And so it's kind of a validation process for them. But the bread and butter is working with small to mid-sized companies, either small because they want to get out of the starting blocks, or mid-size. They started to scale, but this weight of business operations people and spreadsheets is too unwieldy, and the CEO and the board don't know, how fast and where they're growing and where their money's coming from. And those are my two core client groups that I'm selling into. As far as their verticals are concerned, it's all over the place, from healthcare focus to, like I said, professional services, a lot of them in information security, but that's because of my prior background.
Absolutely great. Can you walk us through the steps you take with a potential client to improve their pipeline and revenue generation?
I can. I typically take them through a 4-step process. And the first step is something called revenue framing, where I basically go in and I say, okay, give me every piece of information you have, quantitative information. Where are your leads coming from? What are the volumes? How many come through LinkedIn? How many come through email? How many come through referrals, outbound sales, cold calling, what have you? In some cases, the model can handle about 45 different lead sources. And in my biggest client probably has about 20 different principal lead sources that we model. And then I basically track that all the way through. Typically, it's from some sort of a marketing automation system over here, all the way through to Salesforce or whatever they have as their CRM of choice, so that we can begin to build a model that goes from first contact lead all the way to closed won sale. And that's called revenue framing. It's similar to a house. It's sort of, if I want to build a house, you first put up the frame. And so say, okay, if you want to make next year, $5 million, whatever, let's first calibrate your model against your 2019 or year-to-date performance so that we calibrate it with the real coefficients. Then we load in budgets, and then we load in manpower, and then we have an asset snapshot. That's revenue framing. Second step, then we say, okay, who are you selling into? And then we get into target, what I call precision segmentation, which is basically the approach of saying, okay, who's going to buy? And it's less an MBA or a McKinsey study, more very concrete. If you're selling B2B, chances are you're going to sell through LinkedIn, or chances are you're going to sell through Google Ads, or you go to certain events, or you advertise in certain trade journals. In all of those cases, you have to know which is my vertical, which is my company size, which is my geography, what are the titles, the job descriptions on the hard side, but also what are the psychographic criteria, and with whom do we have social proximity. Most companies sell through their networks. So we intersect the two and we say, okay, that's precision segmentation. Here's your structural criteria, here's your social proximity. We intersect the two, and we now give you a prioritized list of who you're going to contact first, second, third, because each of those segments gets contacted with different technologies. That then goes to the third bucket, value proposition. Okay, so we know how much we need to make, we know where our business is coming from, we know who we're targeting. Now, what's the message we target them with? And again, this is not about doing MBA, 3 months McKinsey study. This is, for example, if you want to sell through LinkedIn, like what you did, you have 300 characters. And how do you make a connection in 300 characters? It's if you sit down with a CTO and you ask them, hey, tell me how great your product is, I'll get a 2-hour dissertation. I need 300 characters. To condense a value prop down to 300 characters is not easy. So we take people through a value propositioning process, which is part analytical, where and how do you add value, but it's also a lot of it is creative. What's an emotionally appealing way of telling your story, so that when you have those 300 characters or that LinkedIn, that Google ad or an online blog, that you're not just intellectually, but also emotionally connecting. So that's the third step. And then the fourth step is basically you pull that all together into a go-to-market plan. We know how much we need to make from each of these channels. We know who we're aiming at. We know what our value proposition is. Now let's break this down into the go-to-market plan. And let's say it's, we need these pieces of content. We're going to hit these target demographics. We're going to go through these channels. Here's what we need for sales enablement. Here's what we need for ROI, and so forth. Then you have a complete growth architecture plan that's implementable. And then from there, we typically go into monthly maintenance, where we then say, okay, how we're doing, what's working, what's not working, which of the messages do we continue with, what do we change, those kinds of things. So
Perfect.
Those are four steps.
Great. No, that sounds very straightforward, even though in reality it most likely not always is.
It's fairly complex under the hood, but we're trying to sort of simplify a lot of complexity into something that people can wrap their mind around.
To follow up on this, obviously you have different clients, different sizes. What are like the differences between a company that might have just received Series A or Series B funding in comparison to a company who might look at a Series D or Series E? What are the typical challenges or differentiations you see there?
That's a good question. I would say the two principal challenges are the following. On the Series A seed round, early stage, They might have a few systems in place, but the concrete hasn't hardened yet. So they tend to be more flexible. They have a deck that they got funded with, and they have a value prop, and it's fairly cosmic. They haven't necessarily translated that into what are the concrete programs, what works. And so I like working with them the most, quite frankly, because you can start from scratch. You have a green field. You can say, well, for you guys, it's going to be LinkedIn, or it's going to be conferences, or it's going to be, we're going to rent a blimp and we'll float it over the Golden Gate Bridge and it'll make you famous. Whatever ends up being the go-to-market strategy, those guys are open to. And you also don't have a lot of old bad habits that you now have to break. But the downside is they don't have as much money. So, you end up having fairly condensed project budgets. On the mid-size sort of CDE round kind of companies, typically they have a lot of stuff that has that's been built, and there's some religious persuasions where people just have these ideological convictions on how to do things, and it's not working. So now you end up having to go through and do a fair amount of political glass breaking before you can move forward. So the upside there is that you have, of course, a much more payment-willing audience, but the downside is you have to unwind a lot of bad habits. Typically, you have massive data quality problems. They ran up Salesforce, and they have Marqetu or HubSpot, and they don't talk to each other. And by the way, if the CEO says, well, we need to sell into a certain vertical, and then the guy from business ops says, but we don't know where the verticals are, because they never populated the database in Salesforce with information around vertical, company size, geo, and so forth. They just have emails and maybe phone numbers. You can't build a go-to-market strategy around that. So there's a lot of fixing and turnaround work that tends to happen with the C, D, and E rounds. And typically the ones that are succeeding, of course, I don't see, but the ones that are running into problems are the ones that I see. And so then that's the kind of stuff that I have to fix.
So as a summary, basically, the smaller ones obviously are faster to adopt changes. The larger companies, or mid-market companies, how you call them, you need to do some political work, basically, to basically move them into the right direction and to break existing patterns that might stop the growth.
Part of it is political, but part of it is the task is just more complex. A small company might have 4 or 5 principal lead sources, events, email, personal networking, and Google ads, whatever. If you're a $50 or $100 million company, you're going to have 50 lead sources. They all need to be managed, and they all need to be captured. So it's just the sheer complexity of pulling that together is much higher. But there's also then the higher political overhead.
Absolutely. What are the typical mistakes that tech startups make when they try to grow fast, and how can they be avoided?
How many hours do we have?
Maybe to speed this up, maybe you can give us the top 3 that you see.
I think the top 3 are data quality. Most companies have atrocious data quality. That's one. The second one I would say is the sales and marketing cultural break. And typically marketing generates the leads, sales has to close them, the two don't talk to each other. Big problem. And I would say that's the second problem. I would say the third problem is the younger people, the sort of the millennials, your generation, they're very familiar with the stuff that I'm talking about. They're like, yeah, it's on the web, duh. And then you talk to ones 50 and 60-year-olds that tend to be the ones that populate the management ranks. Even 40-year-olds, I find the dividing line is sort of somewhere around 40, 45, where below that they're web literate, above that they're not. And then when you walk in and you come in with these new approaches and you're told demand gen is in the cloud and there's interconnected applications and they talk to each other and Visible and Marqetu and HubSpot and Salesforce, they have no idea. And then you end up trying to build. And so you have a lot of what I call the sales 1.0 mindset, where when they grew up 20, 30 years ago, the way you sold it was you hired a bunch of SDRs, you bought a big database, you put them on a phone, start making calls. It doesn't work anymore. And yet they're not familiar with these new approaches. And so there's a big cultural reset, typically in the C-suite, that you have to go through. I would say those are the 3. So the data quality, sales and marketing antagonism or cultural conflict, and getting the C-suite into the 21st century.
Perfect. Good. No, I think that are three very valid points, and it's not the first time I'm hearing of those. So
I'm sure. Yeah.
I think you're spot on with those.
Yeah.
Um, Going basically switching a little bit to the current situation.
Mhm.
A lot, of course, at the moment there's a high focus on pipeline and revenue generation,
Yeah.
which is obviously very, very important right now.
Right.
But many companies face less traffic, less leads, and have vanished opportunities. So, what advice can you give companies that are basically struggling with COVID or in general any other crisis that might hit the economy?
Yeah, boy, I spend several hours every day talking to people and collecting information of what works and what doesn't, because right now the old rule books don't work, and this is the recession of a century, and so everybody's laying railroad track as the engine is coming, and so there's no predetermined answer that you can't go into the bookshelf and say, oh yeah, that was published in 1962, that still holds. It isn't. This is new. And so, with that said, I would say there's really, and you'll hear more tomorrow at the webinar that you'll be attending. But the I would say there's three things. The first one is obviously cash flow, and I can see in my own client population and as well as my sample of people that I survey, they kind of fall into three buckets. There are the ones that are kind of on the edge and it was marginal to begin with, and now the revenue dried up and they're being pushed underwater. They have to go very quickly into cash containment mode, whether that means layoffs or cutting off consultants, what have you. I feel sorry for them because depending on how long this is going to last, they may get flushed out. The second group is sort of, they're still a little bit in the sort of deer in the headlight stage. They're changing things. And some of them, I see companies that are just keep on keeping on and they haven't changed a thing. Of course, they don't sell anything, but there's a group of about 25% or so that are actually leaning into the wind and that are realizing that this is going to be a cultural transition. This is going to be an economic transition. And you probably, when you went to business school, read Schumpeter from Austria and creative destruction. So whenever there's a volcanic eruption, afterwards there is a new growth. And this 25%, they're homing in on what are the areas of new growth. And a lot of my still going engagements, I'm lucky enough that I have about 6 engagements that are still ongoing. Half of them are in that lean into the wind bucket, and half of them are in that sort of middle bucket. And I would say the advice then, first advice is cash containment. Second advice is tactically change your messaging, change your go-to-market, stop selling, start marketing, go out with thought leadership content, shift to digital, got to get out of events. This is basically marketing's hour. Selling is out and marketing is in, and especially the new online-based marketing on thought leadership content, nurturing, build a relationship, those kinds of things. And that's a lot of tactical changes. For some organizations, they're totally ready. Bring it on, no problem. I've been doing this for years. There's for others, especially the ones that are still sort of their mindset is sales 1.0, and they're now caught with their pants down because they have no idea how this new selling works. And I would say the third thing to do is sort of saying, okay, once you've stabilized your cash, you re-engineered the way you do demand gen, and you change your messages, you're starting to go digital, all that good stuff. I think it's a great opportunity to step back and say, let me brainstorm about the afterwards. How am I going to position myself for long-term growth? We know that most likely the world's going to go digital sooner rather than later. Whether it's online shopping to, do we really have to have that marble paneled office? Why can't we run our company virtually? On and on and on. But there's also going to be cultural and political changes. If you're manufacturing, most of the world's going to balance their manufacturing chains away from China, for example. That's going to have massive implications. And all of that requires a bit of strategic foresight to sort of say, which of these currents can we catch? I have an interesting snapshot. I mean, I talk to companies that are just dying on the vine right now. A lot of the B2C plays, for example. I have other companies like my demand is going through the roof. And I have people that are in cyber training, for example. I have a company that does um, artificial intelligence enhanced quality control in the manufacturing show floor, where you can basically replace your quality inspectors with optical software. These guys are going crazy. So it really depends on thinking through what are likely long-term changes. So I think it's those three, cash containment, change operating procedures, adapt your demand generation, more marketing, less selling, and long-term strategic replanning and revisioning. And the sky's the limit there. I mean, this is a great opportunity, and the smart people are getting going.
That's great, and thanks for breaking it down in a structured way. Very German of you, very appreciated.
Yes.
No, that's absolutely great, and I think that's a good guidance for companies that are in the current situation and basically trying to find a way forward.
Yeah, it's different for every company. Obviously, I'm giving sort of general recipes, but the different flavors of all of those three things is what I see all the companies that I'm in touch with doing.
Great. So maybe shifting the focus a little bit from your customers towards what you do at Marqetu.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give any insight on how you tackle the current situation? How do you drive leads? How do you find new opportunities for your business at the moment?
Well, I'm kind of eating my own dog food, so I definitely am not selling. I do a lot of relationship building. I do a lot of counseling. I do a lot of very soft shoe, provide thought leadership content.
Mm-hmm.
I make a living by being at the leading bleeding edge of things, and I've been doing that for years. That's what the Silicon Valley is all about.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you read something, it's already old. So if you want to be at the forefront of things, you have to be in a continuous dialogue with thought leaders in various spaces, marketing thought leaders, technology thought leaders, and so forth. So I'm networked into several groups. I do a lot of active survey work where I actually go out and talk to people. And, I'm a trained marketer, so I've been doing this for 30 plus years. And so I read between the lines and find out what are people thinking about, what they're worried about, and, where they're headed and so forth. And out of that usually emerges a point of view. Again, you don't have to outrun the lion. You just have to outrun the other guy. And in this particular case, or at McKinsey, we used to say, if you're 3 days ahead of the client in your thinking, you're ahead of the client. So I'm basically trying to stay 3 days ahead of the market and figuring out where is it headed, what are the next steps, what are the thought leaders doing. And then I typically then translate that into written content, put out webinars, blogs, and so forth, and publish that out. That's a way for me to stay close to my marketplace. I'm also giving good advice to my customers because what I've done, I've actually tried before I advise them on it. And I'm doing brand building. And so those are the three things that I'm doing to cope with it. I'm lucky where I don't have to worry about cash flow issues, but some other people don't have that luxury. And so I can afford to do a little forward-looking research-based stuff like what I'm talking about.
Great. But that basically ties into your long-term strategy, which might have avoided you having cash flow problems at the moment, if I follow your logic.
Yeah. Well, I have a side business where I import drugs. No, just kidding. But anyway, so I agree. I think this is you right now, all bets are off, and you have to really figure out where's the puck going. And if you sit there in your chair and you're waiting for the sky to fall, you're not going to get anywhere. You got to get going. So.
Makes sense. Are there any tools or software that you can recommend, for example, for startups or other tech companies that basically generate a huge amount of value? I mean, you mentioned a few of them already. Is there anything you can highlight which might help?
Well, yes. So well, first of all, it depends on what stage you're in. You asked me earlier, early startup, mid stage, late stage, and so forth. They all have different technology stacks.
Mm-hmm.
They all have the same problem, which is it doesn't tie together at the C-suite. And so that's sort of a plug for my own stuff, but that's a separate thing. I think the key, the answer there, and then this is, by the way, next week's webinar, how do you build up a quickie digital technology stack? The key thing is to first have a clear sense of what is the demand generation problem that I'm solving. Where am I going to get my demand from? Then in order to get that demand, what do I need as software solutions. Let's say, I'm making this up, if my marketing is in LinkedIn and I'm a startup and I don't have the money for Salesforce yet, I use a simple CRM like Pipedrive, then how do I feed leads into Pipedrive and how do I do follow-up? Well, it turns out there's a whole ecosystem of applications that one needs to have in place. Something called Link Match, which allows you to bulk import leads from LinkedIn into Pipedrive, so you don't have to manually cut and paste. There's products called DuckSoup, DUX-Soup, or Alfred. Those are basically bulk invite tools. They do what SalesLoft does for the sales automation. They do it for LinkedIn. And you might have an email solution where they use Pipedrive's Mailigen, or you use something like Sales Handy or what have you. And so depending on where and how you generate demand, you put together an architectural plan on what's my software stack. Now, this is what I just talked about. The names I mentioned would be good for a startup, your A-round company that doesn't have. Mid-round is a little different. You might upgrade your marketing automation to something like HubSpot, and you might have more sophisticated, you need to get into cleaning up your leads, enriching your lead databases. So you get into things, you need to get into lead routing. You now have 10 salespeople. And you need to make sure that as the leads come in, they go to the right person, and you can actually track all the events. And it gets more sophisticated, so you have things like lead space and so forth. And then, of course, if you're finally graduating to an industrial scale, then it's hard to get around something like Marqetu and Salesforce, and then what they have in their respective ecosystems to support them.
Great,
all the
great.
dialers and those kinds of things. I think the piece that and this is where maybe the PathMonk folks can come in. The piece that's by and large underappreciated, and I think will get more and more attention paid to, is the inbound web leads. Most everybody sort of, especially if they have a sales 1.0 mindset, they're doing everything outbound. Inbound, how do I attract them? Rather than going after people with a fly swatter, how do I put out honey so that the flies come to me? And how do I know that they're coming in? And for example, we use interesting product called Crazy Egg that gives you, who's looking at your website and where are the eyeballs going. So again, there's 7,000 marketing apps out there. It's an overwhelming offer of what you can use. That's why it's always useful to start out from your strategy, work backwards into what's the supporting technology I need, where am I in the growth stage, then pick something that fits that. And I think the stuff that's generally focused on inbound leads is going to get higher and higher ranked, because you got to wait for people to come to you right now. They're not they're not willing to receive a sales call or an outbound communication. And so I would say that's an area, and I think PathMonk or so is a great application for that side of the business.
Good, great, thank you. So we're basically coming towards the end of the interview today. So maybe as a last question, can you tell us one thing that everyone should remember about your company, and how can interested people get in touch with you?
That's a good question. I guess the thing to remember, actually, can I make it two things?
You can make it two things.
The concept is growth architecting, and the idea is basically it's back at this question: if I want to make X million next year, where is it going to come from this year? And put together your architecture, and think of it like a river diagram. You have what's a big river? The Rhine River. The Rhine River flows through Germany and goes into the North Sea. Well, it's going to get all its tributaries, but by the time you have your volume of closed business, that's the amount of water that flows through Rotterdam. Where did they come from? And people don't know that, and they certainly don't quantify that. So that's growth architecting. And the second thing is just Marqetu is a funny way of spelling it. So it's a Q instead of a K, and it's a U instead of a YOU. But other than that, anything you want to know, marqetu.com.
Perfect. Johannes, with that, I say thank you very much for your insights today. It's very interesting and great to have you on the show.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the opportunity.